Well, you were at the farmers' protest in Westminster this week, hearing from plenty of people opposed to the proposals, including the likes of Kemi Badenoch and Ed Davey speaking to farmers. Far from the typical protest crowd, though.
Yeah, I mean, a lot more wax jackets and ruddy cheeks, a lot more wellies, but I mean, not so different in some ways. I think it was interesting that it was a very polite demonstration, very sort of friendly, but also, I mean, sort of the industry in general is extremely despondent and very angry because it's not just the issue of the budget. This is something that's been burning for a long time.
You were down there too.
I think it's really important as a journalist to go to these things because, you look at a lot of the media and you think on the left that this was a protest got up by the far right. There'd be Tommy Robinson there. UKIP would be there in very large numbers. And it was sort of, as it were, a very political anti-Labour protest. And that was just not true. The vast majority of people there, 3 generations from the same farm, kids, grandparents, it was, as Will says, overwhelmingly good-humoured. There's an undercurrent of deep anger, but it was good-humoured, it was traditional, it was quiet. I was standing next to somebody and it was absolutely Baltic. It was really cold. And I said, God, we're going to have to stand here for hours and hours and hours. And he turned to me and said, standing in the cold for hours and hours and hours, Andrew, is what I do all year round. Yeah, so, so they used to. I thought it was quite moving, actually. I was and yes, of course, there were lots of right-wing figures there. And yes, of course, Kemi Badenoch was making hay with it. Ed Davey gave a very, very interesting, very good speech, I thought. But it wasn't the sort of, this was a real protest, put it that way. These are people who feel genuinely upset, genuinely don't agree with the Treasury and the government figures about the number of estates that are going to be affected and all the rest of it.
Well, let's pick up on the figures because the numbers being bandied around by the different sides, if you like, are so wildly different. Well, just remind listeners and viewers of what the proposals are and why this huge discrepancy, because you've got the government saying it's going to be a matter of, a few hundred farms per year, the farmers saying 70,000.
Yeah. So what's at the base of it, at a very fundamental level, is you've got a Labour government that has come in and said, that one of our principles is going to be the difference between work and wealth. And what they mean when they say, people with the broadest shoulders are going to help to fix the foundations is people with wealth are going to pay the most tax. And, we're going to introduce changes that tax those people more. And farmers do, or landowners do have a lot of wealth. And that's partly because they've been allowed to sort of build up more wealth by this tax relief. So, it's 2 tax reliefs, actually. So what changed in the budget was Rachel Reeves, she didn't remove these reliefs. She put a new cap where inheritance tax has to be paid, still at half the rate, but over £1 million worth of assets. So previously, farmers had these 2 reliefs called agricultural property relief and business property relief. So APR is your fields and your farmhouse. BPR is your tractor, and lots of other things, obviously. But those were things that you didn't have to pay any inheritance tax on at all when handing on your property to the next generation, as farming families often do. Some of the people I've spoken to this week have been, 7th generation farmers. Now, from May of next year, those families will have to pay above £1 million per person with some extra reliefs that everyone gets for inheritance tax. They will have to pay 20% inheritance tax.
Whereas everyone else pays 40%.
Yes, yeah, above certain other reliefs. So, and actually, once you combine all those reliefs together, a couple that owns a farm and passes it on to their children still get £3 million worth of tax relief, 100% tax relief, and then they're still paying half tax on the rest of it, which sounds like these are really rich people who are still getting a massive tax break. What the farmers say is, actually, we have to have loads of assets in order to make any money at all. So one of the farmers that I spoke to this week, fairly typical, The farm is owned by her dad and his two brothers. And the whole estate with everything on it is worth roughly somewhere in the region of 10 million quid. Sounds like they're really rich. But the income they make, the salaries they actually pay themselves, is 24 grand a year each. And these, farmers work 7 days a week typically. So they are working for less than minimum wage, but they're rich in the eyes of a treasury spreadsheet. In the eyes of an accountant, it seems like they've got loads of wealth, but their wealth is
isn't there a
different
parallel? I mean,
to
we hear
other
this is the standard argument we hear about people opposed to inheritance tax, which polling from YouGov last year actually suggests that most of us don't like it. Like 61% think it's an unfair tax. But isn't that just the standard argument? Yes, of course it applies to farmers as well, but you do have asset-rich, cash-poor people who've just happened to live in a home that's appreciated massively in value, and they have to pay inheritance tax.
Well,
their children will have to pay inheritance tax.
Can I jump in on this?
Yeah.
Because I'm a vehement supporter of inheritance tax. I think it's an excellent tax. And, it's part of how we get equity between the generations and how we tax accumulated wealth. But I really think when you're talking about agricultural land, you are not talking about wealth in the sense that you and I would normally think, yes, this soil is incredibly valuable. By the way, partly because very, very rich individuals have bought it up to avoid tax and thereby pushing the price of lands up. And that's not the farmer's fault. But also, it's not wealth in the sense that you can use it for anything else. It is there to grow food on. It is the absolute fabric of their businesses. So it's not wealth in the sense of really wealthy people. What Will was saying there about incomes is absolutely borne out by the statistics. I think the average income for a farmer in quite a big farm in the UK is around £50,000 a year at the moment, and it's going down, not up. And Will pointed out quite rightly that it's not just about this budget. They've the cost of animal feeds, of fertilizers, of energy, of all sorts of things has gone rocketing up. They've had to deal with Brexit. It has been a really, really rough time for farming.
And I think I completely agree with Andrew on it's a different kind of wealth. And it's a wealth that they have been forced to accumulate effectively, partly by the people that Andrew mentioned. I mean, so alongside the farmers, the problem with a tax relief is when you give people a break, other people will spot it or their accountant will spot it and say, we could use that. So there are two different other groups of people alongside farmers who use this. So there are people who have bought swathes of agricultural land because that they could use it as a store of value that they could pass on without paying any inheritance tax. There are lots of other people, and I think farmers are slightly less worried about the billionaires and more worried about the people who've bought a very big house in the country that comes with, say, 10 or 15 acres, and they've registered the pony paddock. So now they're farmers. They're absolutely not. And it should be possible for HMRC to filter these people out. But it's those people who a lot of farmers say they're skewing the data, and that's what makes it appear to the Treasury that, sort of limited number of people will be affected by this, limited proportion, because those ones, like they'll still, sort of the estates aren't necessarily worth all that much. Whereas a working farm, you don't really get a working productive farm with less than £1 million worth of asset, or even less than £3 million.
I completely agree with all that. One final point, because some people will say, well, okay, they have to sell the land for inheritance tax. That's fine. Somebody else will buy it. Somebody else will farm it. It doesn't really matter. Farming is a very, very difficult, very hard, but also a trade where you need to know your own land. You need to know about it. And I think it's one of those areas where actually passing it down family to family to family benefits us all, because you get people who really understand these hills, that loam, the texture of that kind of property in a way that an incomer would not. You can't just sort of push farmers out and think more farmers will come in and take their place and everything will be tickety-boo, because it won't. There
is an awful lot of support in the country for farmers, and Ben Walker, our polling expert, has said that in the last week, polling suggests that 52% of us support them compared to just 28% who don't. And interestingly, that's 41% of Labour voters support farmers too. Andrew, is this another example of this government just not really handling an announcement very well?
they're strangely unpolitical, aren't they, in some respects? I mean, I do think the Rachel Reeves argument that, farming families also depend on the NHS and on schools and on roads and all the things that she must raise taxes to repair. She is in a real bind about this. And I get it. She hasn't raised capital gains tax in the way we were expecting. She hasn't done lots of other things. And of course, you don't hear a peep from the people who are relieved about that. So I get it. But at the same time, Labour now has quite a lot of farming constituencies, and they're going to lose every single one of them like this because they have infuriated. There was always a kind of anti-Labour, anti-urban, anti-Islington, anti-North London. I saw one poster saying, if we grew avocados, you wouldn't be doing this. That instinct has always been deeply...
There's the stuck farmer poster as well, wasn't there? Which
I didn't see that one.
I'll leave that to people's imaginations.
Stuff.
Oh.
Okay.
Took me a moment to get that.
I still haven't. Okay.
Swap some letters around.
Spoonerism.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Oh, it's stuck. They are. And Starmer, Farmer, Harmer, and all the rest of it. Thinking about the politics of this, there has been a long-standing anti-Labour feeling in the countryside. They are naturally small C as well as big C conservative people. And you could see it by looking at them, as it were, and talking to them. And they thought Labour was going to have their backs, and they are genuinely very, very angry. So there is another big chunk of the electorate, not a big chunk, but a chunk of the electorate covering an awful lot of constituencies in England and Wales who are not going to come back to Labour at the next election. And that's a loss.
There is a fix to this problem, which is to do what farmers have been asking successive governments to do for a very long time, which is to intervene even more in the market. Obviously, the government intervenes to a great deal of the food market already to keep food cheap. But essentially farmers, and this is true in other countries as well, feel that they are being put out of business by retailers, by supermarkets and by the people who buy from the farm to supply the supermarket. And it's very, very difficult for a government to intervene in that process and say, right, supermarkets have to pay farmers more, because then you'll get food price inflation. And I think voters would probably be more opposed to food price inflation than they would be to farmers going out of business, certainly in the first instance. The question is whether if lots of farmers go out of business, you might get food price inflation anyway. So it's a really long-standing problem where you have this group of people who represent less than 1% of GDP, but they produce more than 60% of our food by economic value. So you've got a problem of a group of people whose problem you need to fix. And what the government's done this time is it's ignored that problem and introduced another one, which looks right as an accounting problem, but as a coming up with lots of different solutions to kind of make the economy work and make sure people can still have cheap sausages, but also, the land to be stewarded responsibly and that kind of thing. It's not as simple as just saying, okay, some people have got some wealth and we can take a bit of that.
But it comes down to the perennial problem, doesn't it, that we want these things, but no one seems to be prepared to pay for them. We want
That's right.
And
we want decent food, we want a good functioning NHS, we want good schools. But actually, those things cost money.
And it's about unintended consequences as well. So I think this feels to me a lot like in 2021 when the government said, right, we're going to fix the problem with IR35 tax rules, where you had lots of lorry drivers and cab drivers setting up their own little company to employ themselves, and they were paying less tax. Some people were entitled to do it. Some people were abusing the system. Same with the agricultural relief. The unintended consequence was suddenly lots of middle to sort of late middle-aged lorry drivers went, right, I'm not sleeping in a lay-by anymore. I've got enough. I'm retiring. And suddenly you had a massive HGV driver shortage, and everyone was worried about how that was going to contribute to inflation, and we had to recruit people from overseas and try and find other workarounds. This feels a lot like that period.